In the spring of 1851, the people of Bracken Hollow awoke to a sight that would not leave them. The parish graveyard had been tampered with, not smashed in rage, but handled as if by a meticulous caretaker. Soil was loosened in clean lines. Coffins were unlatched, never broken. Bones were missing but never tossed aside. And in every opened grave, a single strip of red ribbon lay threaded neatly through the hollow where a jaw or femur should have been. No one connected the quiet desecrations to the family that had arrived only a month before. Few even admitted to seeing their arrival, though deep ruts from a heavy carriage marked the northern road. They called themselves the Havelocks. For adults, 3 children, and one more figure no one could describe with certainty. They paid 6 months' rent for the old vicarage by the river and began sealing its windows from the inside. The doctor said it was for warmth. The constable said privacy. Reverend Tilby, who lived across the lane, said nothing. But neighbors saw him that same night, kneeling in his garden and murmuring into the earth. The Havelocks never joined the Sunday service, a rare thing in a place where the church bell set the rhythm of life. They were polite without warmth, speaking just enough to end a conversation before it could begin. Mrs. Havelock, tall and unsmiling in elbow-length gloves, nodded once to the milliner's wife and never returned. Mr. Havelock spent hours pacing the riverbank, reading aloud in Latin. The schoolmaster swore he heard the words ex ossibus, from the bones, repeated again and again, and from the eldest child, a girl of 12, came strange songs, long, wavering notes that clung to the air. At night, she stood at the attic window, head tilted, listening. Miss Edeline Moore, Bracken Hollow's last remaining midwife, received a letter one autumn evening. It bore no signature, only a wax seal faintly scented of iron, and a request for her assistance in storing relics too delicate for untrained hands. No one was ill, the note claimed. In her long career, Edeline had delivered 119 children and buried nearly half of them before they'd drawn breath. She did not scare easily. Yet the moment she stepped through the Havelock door, her knees weakened. The air carried no hint of sickness, only the briny sting of salt, and an undercurrent of something like candle wax burned too close to teeth. It was the Havelock daughter who led her inside, barefoot, head bowed, silent. The girl's hands were wrapped in gloves not of cloth but of coarse gauze, and something beneath the wrappings pulsed faintly, as though alive. The room Edeline entered was no nursery, nor any parlor she'd ever seen. The walls were bare stone, hung with rosaries older than the parish itself. On a table stood 7 glass jars, each holding a single human bone surrounded by rose petals. Some floated in clear liquid. One gave off a faint hum. Edeline said nothing. She turned and left without asking for payment. Before sunrise, she had packed her bags and boarded the northbound mail cart. When asked later why she had gone so suddenly, Edeline's answer was short and without hesitation. I know a reliquary when I see one, and that was no saint they were keeping. By midsummer, the river had gone still, neither flowing nor freezing. Frogs vanished, birds abandoned the reeds, and fish pulled from the water had no eyes. The Havelocks remained untouched. Their crops grew taller than any others. And at dusk, their children walked the property barefoot, in perfect unison, always counterclockwise. By late summer, Bracken Hollow had grown unervingly still. Horses no longer called from their stalls. The blacksmith's hammer lay unused, its head rusting in place. Even the youngest infants cried in strange, stuttering patterns, as if following some rhythm only they could hear. The Havelocks seemed untouched by the change. Their fields flourished. Their lanterns burned all night without a drop of oil. Yet the family was seen less and less, save for the children, who emerged only at dusk. Barefoot and silent, they walked in slow, measured steps along the edge of the orchard, circling always counterclockwise. Then the digging began. On moonless nights, thin lamplight glowed in the Havelock orchard as shadows moved in precise formation. Witnesses, few and reluctant, spoke of 7 holes, each one identical in depth and width, carved into the soil with meticulous care. Inside, the pits were lined with cedar shavings and pages torn from more than one Bible, the scripture jagged at the edges. A lone traveler, bound for Taro's mill, claimed to see the final burial. He described Mrs. Havelock lowering something into the last of the 7 holes. A small jawbone, he thought at first. But it was too long for a child, etched with letters that seemed to shimmer even in the dark. The traveler did not stop in Bracken Hollow. He rode through without slowing, only looking back once. His horse collapsed at the border of the next township, foam at its mouth, blood pooling at its ears. The man, pale and trembling, refused to speak of what he'd seen, not to his priest, not in confession, not ever. And still, the red ribbons appeared, tied in careful bows over freshly turned earth. The first crate arrived in the dead of winter, no larger than a shoebox. It was wrapped in coarse sackcloth and sealed with red wax bearing no emblem. It was delivered not to a church or museum, but to the home of Alderman Josiah Bell, a retired merchant who hadn't taken communion since 1837. The coachman who brought it said nothing, merely placed the box in Bell's trembling hands, tipped his hat, and vanished down the frostbitten road. Inside, swaddled in linen, was a small object and a single note, the handwriting slanting like it was bending the candlelight. Return what was never yours. The prayer is in the marrow. Bell, whose hands had once signed contracts for whole shiploads of sugar, dropped the relic after a single touch. It made no sound when it hit the floor, none at all, as if the air itself recoiled from it. Days later, he was seen walking barefoot toward the ruined chapel on Hollow Pike, carrying no lantern. When they found him, he was seated upright in the collapsed nave, eyes open and fixed on the vine-choked window above. The relic was gone. In its place, at his feet, lay a human spine, child-sized, each vertebra engraved with a psalm, but not in any order Scripture had ever known. Soon, more crates appeared. One arrived for Mrs. Eliza Rogg, the apothecary, another for Reverend Cale Dunham, head of the seminary. Some contained bones, others only dust. Some bore instructions, cryptic, unsettling. No one saw who delivered them. No carriage wheels marked the snow. No footprints trailed to their doors. And yet, each time a crate was opened, something in Bracken Hollow seemed to grow quieter. The dreams began among the children. At first, they were only faint murmurs in the night, small whimpers that stopped the instant a candle was lit. Then the mothers started waking to find blood beneath their fingernails, with no memory of clawing at the floorboards. Even the constable was found wandering the chapel grounds barefoot, muttering in a language he swore he had never learned. Every dream was the same. It began with a staircase, neither wood nor stone, but something smooth, pale, and faintly warm. The steps were made from human shin bones. The railing was stitched from long, coarse hair. Down they went, spiraling far beneath the roots of the town. At the bottom lay a chamber vast enough to swallow the sound of one's own breathing. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling. On each shelf rested a single fragment of a human body. Tongues, thumbs, teeth, each labeled not with a name, but with a sin. At the center of the chamber sat a figure, its form shifting in the half-dark. It did not speak. It only listened, as though waiting for something to be offered. In the dream's final moment, the dreamer would be handed a small box. No ribbon, no lock, along with a voice that whispered, "Yours to carry, yours to add." When they woke, the dreamers felt heavier, as if something unseen had been placed inside them. Some tried to pray it away. Others stopped sleeping altogether. But no one could explain why. When the sun rose, fresh red ribbons appeared over graves that had been untouched the day before. The spring thaw never came to Bracken Hollow. The river stayed locked in ice, though the air had turned warm enough to rot fallen leaves. Saplings withered at the root. Bees vanished. Children born that season did not cry, not mute but unwilling. When they finally spoke, it was in fragments of old burial rites, spoken with perfect cadence, though no one had taught them. By midsummer, the town's maps began to betray their owners. Roads shifted. Paths that once led to wells ended in tangled thickets. One man swore the sky had turned the wrong color during a short walk, too much red where blue should have been. A mirror in another man's home reflected the chapel standing behind him, though he was miles from it. In autumn, the trees shed their leaves in a single night. Come morning, the ground was covered not in gold or red, but in brittle white leaves that crumbled to dust when touched, like paper pulled from an ancient book. It was then that the first voices came from underground. The gravedigger heard them while working, a slow recitation of names, some in Latin, others unknown. "They're not asking for prayers," he said, spade shaking in his hand. "They're taking attendance." By winter, the stars began to vanish. Not all at once, but one by one, night after night. They did not blink out. They simply dimmed, like candles snuffed by unseen hands. The moon remained, though dulled, its light the color of old bone. And in the crypt of the chapel, new work had been done. At its deepest point stood a door, wood as black as pitch, traced in brass shaped like a human spine. There was no handle, no lock, only a single message scratched shallow into the surface. "For the one who returned the wrong remains." By the turn of the year, Bracken Hollow no longer buried its dead. The bodies were left seated upright in the church pews, hands folded, heads bowed, as if awaiting a service that had either ended long ago or never begun. Then, one night, a sound rose from beneath the Havelock property. Not a cry, not music, but a slow, deliberate knocking. It was too organic to be wood. It was the sound of joints shifting, cartilage bending, something larger than memory trying to rise. Those who lived near the river claimed they saw light in the attic windows of the Havelock house, though the glass had been shattered for a decade. The glow pulsed once every few seconds, measured, deliberate, like a message in code no one could remember how to read. By dawn, 7 birds lay dead in the town square. Each was from a different species. Each was missing a single bone, removed with surgical precision. There was no blood, no torn flesh. In the square's center stood a new reliquary, shaped like a lantern, but empty. That same morning, the mayor locked himself in the courthouse and began writing a single sentence on the walls in chalk. "You cannot preserve what you do not mourn." Over and over, until his hands bled and the words blurred into unreadable white smears. 3 days later, they found him collapsed on the floor. He had no memory of writing, yet even in sleep he whispered the phrase. Around that time, every mirror in Bracken Hollow cracked. Not from a blow, but in perfect, slow splintering rings. People began dressing in the dark, combing their hair by memory. Those who caught their shadows moving too slowly turned away, not from fear, but from shame. And in locked drawers and buried boxes, the reliquaries began to whisper. When the county men arrived, they expected ruin. Overgrown fields, collapsed houses, maybe a few stragglers too stubborn to leave. Instead, Bracken Hollow stood eerily intact, though wrong in ways they could not name. Roads were too narrow, houses seemed to lean inward, as if listening to something beneath the soil. They found the chapel first. Its bell tower had collapsed years before, but the nave still stood, doors wide, pews undisturbed. At the altar rested a box, pale wood, salt-stained, breathing faintly. It matched descriptions from older reports about the Havelocks, but no one touched it. They only measured it, wrote down its dimensions, and moved on. That night, each man dreamed the same dream. A long corridor made from human vertebrae, the walls humming with wordless hymns. Behind them, voices recited genealogies backward. Ahead, a child waited, opening a reliquary shaped like their own ribcage. Inside, something wet and pulsing refused to die. By the 3rd day, their ledgers began erasing themselves. Names blurred, dates rearranged, ink faded to nothing. One man tried carving his notes into tree bark, only to find the grooves sealed over by morning. Another buried his compass as an experiment. Yet even underground, the needle spun without pause. On the 4th night, they followed a strange knocking to the edge of the cemetery. The graves had turned, headstones now faced inward, toward the chapel and the breathing box on the altar. In the old constable's abandoned house, they found soot marks on the walls, outlines of reliquaries, each bearing initials. The last mark was still damp, labeled HB. Horace Bray, the eldest clerk among them, was still alive. But the outline of his box was already there. In the summer of 1883, the vicar's old orchard, long left to thorns and rot, was being cleared for a new telegraph line. Elias Cotter, a wandering laborer, was hired to haul away the stones. While working beneath the twisted roots of a dead apple tree, his spade struck something that rang like bone. What he unearthed was not a coffin, but a small bone-white case, just large enough to hold a single object. Inside lay a child's skull, yellowed with age yet flawless. No cracks, no soil, no dust. Its eye sockets had been stitched shut with red thread, the knot pulled tight and perfect. Around the base was wrapped a strip of parchment bearing the words, "He who speaks through silence needs no tongue." Elias claimed he felt no fear, only the heavy sensation of being watched from inside his own skin. He carried the skull into town and gave it to Sheriff DeWitt Granger, a young man who dismissed the Havelock stories as rural superstition. Granger examined the skull under lamplight, measuring and weighing it. Without knowing why, he set it on the courthouse lectern and locked the doors for the night. That evening, thunder rolled without rain. The town's dogs howled without pause. And though the chapel's bell had been sold for scrap years earlier, it was heard ringing from somewhere deep underground. At dawn, the skull had shifted on its own, now facing the southern window, toward the empty field where the Havelock house once stood. The thread remained intact, but the sockets were filled with fine black ash that spilled onto the sheriff's boots. Granger said nothing, but within days he began writing letters, apologies addressed to names that appeared on no town records at all. On the night of March 19th, as foretold by the tooth found months earlier, a sound rose from the earth beneath Bracken Hollow. Not a quake, not a collapse, 7 measured tolls of a bell that did not exist. By morning, the tooth was gone. In its place, on the courthouse windowsill, sat the same child's skull from the summer, its red thread frayed, its sockets now packed with salt. Across the courthouse wall, written in dust, were the words, "We are no longer scattered." That same day, the field where the Havelock house once stood began to sink. Not violently, but in a slow, circular settling, as if the ground were exhaling. At the bottom lay a smooth, pale structure the size and shape of a chapel. It bore no cross, no windows, no door. Around its rim, in letters cut as fine as bone dust, was the inscription, "When every relic is gathered, the sermon may begin." The sheriff's replacement, a practical man from out east, insisted they investigate. 3 men volunteered. Ropes were tied, lanterns lit, and the descent began. Partway down, a sound rose to meet them, a muffled chorus, like dozens of voices whispering through snow. One of the men, Joel Heskay, froze. He claimed he heard his mother's voice, though she had been dead for 10 years. He climbed back up, refusing to go farther. The other 2 reached the base, and were never seen again. Their ropes returned, singed at the ends as if by fire, though the grass nearby bore no scorch marks. That night, every reliquary in town split cleanly down the middle. No bones remained inside, only emptiness. Yet the containers pulsed faintly, warm to the touch, as if they were breathing. The next morning, a discovery was made in the ruins of the chapel. A school ledger, its pages dated 5 years in the future. Every child's name was listed, even those not yet born, each marked present. Beneath the names, a single note in ink so dark it seemed to drink the light red. The sermon begins when the mouth is whole. That same week, the oldest woman in Bracken Hollow, blind since girlhood, rose from her bed without aid and walked to the hollow where the ivory chapel stood. In her hand was a gold wedding ring she claimed had belonged to Clara Havelock. No one had believed her story before, but she placed the ring at the chapel's base, whispered a hymn no one recognized, and sat down. She died without struggle, without mark. When her body was prepared, her mouth, long toothless, was found filled with a perfect set of child-sized teeth. After that, offerings began appearing everywhere. A scapula laid across a Bible in the rectory. A human radius placed in a baby's crib, still warm to the touch. Each day something new. The ivory structure split not like a door, but like a mouth. From inside came a slow, damp breath, echoed by dozens of unseen lungs. That night, the townsfolk gathered at the chapel without calling for one another. Voices rose, not in harmony, but in jagged, overlapping layers, as though repeating a hymn they only half remembered. The sound was raw, grief-sharpened, no beauty left in it, and from the hollow, the open mouth whispered back. It was not joy, it was not wrath, it was instruction. It was the midwife, her sight nearly gone, who found the last relic. She followed a faint, steady hum into the eastern woods, where a lone tree stood with human teeth embedded in its bark. At its roots, shallowly buried in oiled altar cloth, she uncovered an infant-sized pelvis. Along the hem of the cloth, embroidered in dark thread, were the words, "Here ends the collection. Let the vessel speak." The relic was carried to the chapel and placed inside the circle of red sand that had formed around the sealed reliquary at its center. For the first time since the Havelocks vanished, the box opened, not with a creak, but with a slow, damp exhale. Inside lay not a bone, but a small, perfectly preserved white tongue. Beside it rested a human ear. The congregation did not flee. No one spoke. They simply knelt, as if an unseen hand had pressed them toward the floor. The sermon began, but no words were spoken. Instead, it was memory, poured through them like water, filling bone and marrow. Every wound, every loss, every name taken from a mouth too soon. One man wept for sins not his own. Another clutched the space beside him where his sister used to sit. The tongue did not move, yet the sound filled every ribcage. It was not a story. It was a count, a meticulous inventory of pain, each offering named and marked. When it was done, the ivory mouth in the hollow closed, and every reliquary in Bracken Hollow fell still, except one, the first, still breathing, still waiting. Its inscription had changed. Who will carry the next generation of remains? Within a week, Bracken Hollow was silent. Not abandoned, just emptied. Doors stood ajar. Meals sat half-eaten, lamps were cold. Horses remained in their stalls, still saddled, as if their riders had stepped away for only a moment. But no footsteps marked the dirt. No voices carried on the wind. The chapel was left exactly as it had been on the night of the sermon. Pews still faced inward toward the reliquary, now sealed again. There was no red sand, no tongue, no bones. Yet the walls had changed. Every beam and plank was marked with names. Some were the names of those who had lived in the town. Others were names no one recognized. A few belonged to those not yet born. The letters weren't carved. They had grown into the wood like veins. At the far edge of town, where the Havelock house once stood, the hollow was filled in, level, grass-covered. But those who stepped onto it felt a weight beneath their boots, as though walking over something not buried, but sleeping. Years later, clerks and archivists came to catalog what was left. Many didn't finish. One fainted. Another fled without a word. A third refused to speak above a whisper again, claiming she had seen her own reliquary in the rafters. The state sealed the chapel and fixed a brass plaque to the door. Historical site, do not disturb. But people did. Every few years, someone slipped inside. They always returned changed. Eyes glassy, hands trembling, some unable to speak. And sometimes, on windless nights, the chapel door opens on its own. A breath moves through the nave, cold and familiar, pressing against the ribs of anyone near enough to feel it. The Havelocks were never gone. They were only gathering.